Hello and welcome to this special broadcast organized in the framework of the third African Economic Symposium hosted by the Policy Center for the New South. My name is Rim Barhab. I am a senior economist here at the Policy Center, and I am pleased to moderate this conversation on what may consider a niche tool, but one with strategic growing relevance, which is debt for climate swaps. So at a time where climate impacts are accelerating and fiscal space across developing countries is shrinking, the question is no longer whether we need new financial instruments, but whether we are serious about deploying them at scale with credibility and in a way that serves both climate justice and financial sustainability. So this is where debt swaps come in. So in principle, they offer a neat solution, so to convert debt obligations into climate investment, but the track record is mixed. So implementation has been often slow, overly donor-led, or marginal in scope. So can we do better? And can these swaps evolve into a viable tool for systemic change, or are we repackaging an old idea with a new label? So to unpack these questions, I am pleased to be joined by an expert uniquely positioned to guide us through this very delicate conversation. So Dr. San Bilal, Executive Director at the European Center for Development Policy Management. Welcome.
Thank you.
So you bring decades of expertise at crossroads of development cooperation, global finance, and EU-Africa relations, and you have been at the forefront of effort to rethink financial partnerships in a more fragmented, multipolar world. So maybe I'll start with the first question. So debt swaps have been around since the 80s, often framed as a win-win mechanisms, yet they've remained peripheral in global finance. So what explains their limited use, and do you see renewed political momentum behind them today?
Yes, definitely. I mean, debt swaps are, in fact, becoming fashionable. It's true that they have not been used for a long time, but I think especially with the environmental concerns and the climate change, then there has been a focus on saying, how do you engage developing countries that are perhaps, having some debts and might have fiscal constraints to really invest in the environment, in the protection of nature. So there's been a lot of debt for nature swaps or for climate, debt for climate swaps more generally, and saying, well, in fact, you could free a bit of, convert some of their debts and swap them for possibility of investments in the environmental or climate arena. So in that sense, that was an element of thinking you can be more climate friendly and you can free some of the financial opportunities even in countries that otherwise might not necessarily do as much as they would like to do. And it started small because it is initially quite complex. You need to have confidence of the market. You need to find the right environment. So the initial ones have been starting rather in a small manner.
So perhaps I'll pick up on that, and maybe to better explain this to our viewers, could you give us an example of a country where they applied these debt for climate swaps and how, in practical ways, how it goes?
So one of the initial ones, in the modern era, I would say, was done by Seychelles. So, a very small country that was concerned about nature conservation of the blue economy and trying to think how they could try to stimulate investments. And I'm mentioning in particular Seychelles because first it's a tiny island, tiny country, but also, it showed at that time, we say it's quite often donor-led, but it was really initiated by the government, by Jean-Paul Adam, who was at the time the Minister of Finance, and was then moved to the UN and at the United Economic Commission for Africa, which has been promoting debt swaps, and now is at the United Nations, really more globally, also talking about some of the issues related to debt swaps. So it shows that the first-hand experience on how a small economy could try to promote these mechanisms, and it was at a small level, but gave an indication of this is possible. And then moving to, and that was a decision by the government. This was not just a decision by one individual, but it shows also that at least from the African side, the critical role that such a person could play then came up. And when we're talking about what is the, debt swaps are not one-size-fits-all type of mechanism or that substitute for any kind of other type of interventions. It's just part of the toolkit of development finance instruments. What can you be doing? And one of them is a debt swap, and then could be done. And then has been replicated. In fact, it's not in Africa that we've seen most of the debt swap, but it's in Latin America that there's been much more. And I think the two key actors for that have been, in particular, the Inter-American Development Bank, that in fact becomes the international center for debt swaps and has been supporting a lot of different debt swaps in Latin America, and the US DFC, the Development Finance Institution of the US, that has provided also guarantees and so on. So they work with also other institutions and so on to try to develop this model. But I think these two actors have been quite in the lead in Latin America. And that offers a lot of perspective also for Africa, that has now been doing some of the debt swaps as well, but at a much lower scale yet than what has been done in Latin America.
Yeah. Do you think that perhaps because Latin America, you mentioned the bank, etc., because it is more integrated, it succeeded more there, or are there any other factors that drive success of these types of financial mechanisms?
One of the factors, of course, has been the Inter-American Development Bank is a very innovative type of institution. Sometimes being small forces institutions to be more agile, to position themselves differently. In that sense, Inter-American Development Bank has been doing a lot of financial innovations, or stimulating a lot of different toolkits and approaches and so on. And one of them was the debt swaps. And so this question that you were saying, it is small scale or it is very costly. Of course, the advantage of having one institution that is doing that on a more regular basis is that you have a lot of learning. It's learning by doing. It's different in each case. It took at the beginning a lot of time to set it up. And so that was a very heavy process, which was also something that would discourage some countries. But in Latin America, because then they were doing some, then other countries are interested. And Inter-American Development Bank has been also happy to share some of the experiences. So, for instance, they have done so in Barbados with the European Investment Bank, that has been able to do. The European, from the European Investment Bank is a European financial institution from the EU and with all the member states, and so they have been they were new kids on the block on these kind of transactions. But by finding an alliance with the IDB, they could promote debt swaps in Barbados. Did this learning. Unfortunately, there is a bit of reluctance from some European corners, but in particular from the European Commission, to support debt swaps. So in spite of the positive experience in Barbados, I think there's a great role to play also for the European Investment Bank in Africa, on the African continent, but you need guarantees and you need mechanisms, and the European Commission that is able to provide these guarantees and so on. Is not, at least the leadership there is not yet convinced that this is necessarily a most efficient type of tool. In my view, for some of the wrong reasons. So, in Africa, we could do much more debt swaps as well.
So I would like to pick up perhaps on that last point. And one critique of past debt swaps is that they've been supply-driven and shaped by creditors' priorities. So in your opinion, speaking about Africa, how can developing countries, particularly in Africa, shape these instruments into their own terms? And are there examples of more demand-driven or nationally owned approaches emerging, just like you mentioned with the Seychelles? And what lessons can we learn from that example?
Yeah, what is driven, as supply-driven, has been the support. Is that, in a sense, a country by itself cannot do a debt swap alone. No, they need to convince the the public actors and the private investors to swap their debts. So they need to have this credibility. And of course, when you're a developing country, to be able to do so with a multilateral development bank or with serious finances like USDFC or Nature Conservancy, that has been one of the institutions, civil society organization that has the technical capacity and helped structure it, has been really important. So in that sense, there is a reliance on external expertise. But in fact, if we really want debt swaps to succeed, they have to be owned and appropriated by the domestic country. Otherwise, this is not possible. You need to have, and the international dimension also brings some kind of lock-in effect. So, for instance, the debt swaps that took place in Gabon, irrespective of the changes of governments and the political pressure, you have these international commitments that is coming there. That means that you cannot reverse a debt swap. So it is important that you're committed to invest. You have to show that you're going to invest in where you said you were going to invest it. You have to show that there is additionality, that you're not substituting and reducing your investment in climate. For instance, by saying, well, the swap will compensate for the budgets I will not spend, and so on. So you need to show additionality. You need to have the right kind of projects. So it requires a lot of elements where, in fact, the credibility depends, and in particular for many developing countries, the credibility also depends from the external for the external actors. So that helps. But if you want it to be successful, it has to be on at the domestic level and respond to the domestic agenda.
Yes, absolutely. And you spoke about the domestic agenda, but we are now, living in a broader environment. There is more geopolitically fragmented with all of these economic challenges and with a very tough climate context. So in this situation or in this area, we've also mentioned this in one of our sessions at the Africa Economic Symposium, climate funding fatigue in donor countries and high debt burden. So do you see debt swap as a path towards a systemic reform or more of a band-aid for liquidity access, for instance?
No, I think it's an innovative tools. First, if you have serious debt vulnerability or debt distress, you cannot have a debt swap because you need to have this credibility that your debt is sufficiently sustainable. So it's not, you cannot do a debt swap when you want to do, in fact what is required is a debt adjustment to debt relief. So I think this is first important, although there is a name of debt in it, and there is an element of conversion, so it can free a bit of the funding. You still need to have sound macro financial conditions, and you cannot be in debt distress to use it. But the second is, of course, the fact that there are fiscal constraints and that there are difficulties in trying to get some of the funding for climate. But I think what we see is that we started for debt for climate or debt for nature swaps, but we're also talking about debt for development or debt for health swaps or debt for food swaps. So there is an interest for saying, in fact, you could try to stimulate investment in some part of the economy that are important for your sustainability. Climate is definitely one important, but also others, where you can convert some of your debt. But you need to convince the markets that this is a credible type of element. So you need guarantees. So that means also quite often it's connected to bond issuance as well. That has a sustainability or climate-linked bonds that would then be supported by specific underlying projects that are identified. So in that sense, you provide some fiscal space to do, and some conditionalities or some incentives for a country to do some of the actions. That will ultimately only work if the country is really committed at the beginning, but there's a strong legal framework to try to ensure that this will that will happen. So that was this kind of credibility dimensions that I was mentioning with international actors. And in a fragmented world, indeed, such kind of mechanism can be quite attractive because you don't do that just in a vacuum. The World Bank, and we were talking also at the symposium, we were talking about the fourth Financing for Development conference in Seville. So there is an explicit also reference to debt swaps and the role that the World Bank and even the IMF perhaps could play. We'll see if that will happen or not, but I think at least that different actors are playing the role. The African Development Bank could be more, perhaps more active on that front as well, perhaps in partnership with some other MDBs, World Bank or the European Investment Bank that I was talking about before. Because there's also an element of not only just finance, but there's an element of governance, and there's an element also of, let's face it, in Latin America, there was also an element of kind of soft power of the, of the Americans being involved. And if Europe, this year there will be a summit in November between Africa and Europe, and they talk about having a win-win type of partnership. So one way of showing these commitments would be also for Europe to engage more forcefully on supporting debt swaps initiatives in Africa and not leaving them just to other partners. And so there's a possibility to scale up some of these interactions.
Absolutely, and you've actually answered part of the questions that came through my mind when you were speaking about the situation, particularly in Africa. I mean, what are the recommendations for African countries, to have more of these instruments? And you mentioned the institution, the governance, having a win-win partnership with Europe. So do you have any other few recommendations or last word that we can conclude?
Yes, I mean, in a sense, each case is special, and so there is not a uniform recipe, but there is a way to standardize debt swaps, because when you do more of these debt swaps and to simplify them so you can get some of them ready faster and to have mechanisms that are in place and that it doesn't take 2 years to try to structure debt swaps, but you can do that much faster. So I was mentioning the experience in Latin America where the Inter-American Development Bank played the role of an anchor. And I think at the African level, there is definitely a role for, I just mentioned the African Development Bank, perhaps some of the other African financial institutions, or perhaps, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, or the African Union Commission, that is more of a political mandate, but to try to create a forum among African countries to be able to share the experience of what does it mean to do a debt swap and what they should do, what they should not do, and then be open to the experience of non-African countries as well to do the learning. But I think that could help a lot to try to standardize on the African continent this kind of approach. And they could do that in partnership, as I was mentioning, with some international institutions as well. But the notion is don't try to think that you have to reinvent the wheel and that you're totally alone in this process and so on, and that each country has to start and discover what is the right process. And once you standardize some of these processes and facilitate an exchange, then you have to tailor it to the very specific conditions and objectives. As I mentioned, you might have a range of possibilities of debt swaps. Perhaps the final conclusion, if you allow me just a few words, is as I was mentioning before, debt swaps is part of a toolbox, financial toolbox for development. So it's also important to think about debt swap in connection to the strategies of the countries. And you were asking me, that is not be supply driven. So it's not just the instrument is to serve an objective, and the objective has to be enshrined in the national development plans of the countries and the NDCs for climate. So think about when you try to achieve a specific objective. strategic development objectives, what are the range of tools that you have? How can you identify finance? And the main comments we make is, don't forget debt swaps. Instead of saying, I want to do a debt swap for the sake of doing a debt swap, is no. See, would a debt swap help for what you would try to achieve? But you have many other type of instruments and initiatives that are also important, through domestic resource mobilization that we talk also a lot about in the symposium, different type of innovative financing mechanisms that are important to consider as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandilal, for your insightful conversation. I think what we can retain from this discussion is that debt swaps must be embedded into national development strategies and grounded in real accountability and also backed by strong institutions on both the debtor and the creditor side. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this discussion in the future.